So one of the problems with intelligent tutoring systems, an important aspect of some of this online learning, like you were showing, is the time and effort it takes to build good labs or learning modules that have good feedback, to be able to parse, the expected input and give back good, reasonable feedback. It's kind of the same problem we've had with compilers for a long time. We still get really bad error messages, especially for newbies. Do you see significant changes or improvements in that coming that's going to significantly speed up the time to build these things?
So I'll give it to Daphne first and then maybe Peter, but let me just ask the panel to try to keep answers brief. What often happens with professorial type panels is there are 3 questions. Each question gets a 5-minute answer from each panelist and the time is up. So let's try not to do that.
Okay, with that warning. We haven't done a lot with that. We think it's a really interesting direction to take. We do think that the power of big data at least identifies the error modes that are most interesting and important to deal with, and that it's okay to have a human in the loop, as we have done in identifying what is the feedback that one ought to give for those common error modes. So I think that really is the promise, is big data as identifying the places where one ought to pay attention.
So I'll agree with that and not add to it much, except that I'm also interested in this problem of compiler errors, and I think that that's also an area where we took all the programs that novice programmers wrote and figured out where they were wrong. We could give much better compiler error messages.
Just on that very same point, another approach to it would be to take advantage of the M in MOOC, that these are massive. And because they're massive, the expense of somebody developing a good response can be amortized over a huge community.
That is true, but when you have thousands of classes, then you do need this. Then it's still a fairly substantial effort to do this for every class. So I think for some of the classes that really are reused year after year after year, intro calculus, intro stats, intro programming, whatever, intro chem, intro physics, it's worth putting in that big investment. For the classes that many of us teach, which change quite a bit from year to year, I'm not sure that you could actually afford to do that.
You gave an example of a student asking a question and this question helping a lot of other students. That's actually one of the central messages of Eric Mazur, that the student teach students better than professors. So one of the things that I would like to have in the world I live in is a video server where students can submit 3 minutes explanation of what they learn and then evaluate them and then share them. And does this fit anywhere? I mean, video or explanation in text or sound, but material created by students for students and then maybe validated through crowdsourcing and finally validated from the professor once it has been filtered. Does this fit in your vision?
Well, so video aside, which we haven't done, the Q&A forum is exactly that. That is, students ask questions, other students answer those questions. The questions are validated by other students, and the instructor, TA, has the option of marking certain answers as being right. That is exactly what we do, modulo the video, which is an infrastructure question, and maybe we'll get to it, or maybe not clear that video is necessarily useful here, but maybe it is.
I should say, I talked about the class that Dan did, and we built that on our own technology, and we're in the process of looking into how we can kind of wrap up that technology and open source it and put it in the hands of anybody who wants to then make something available.
I think it's phenomenal to have 20,000 students finish your class, but how do we get the other 85 or 90% of people to finish? I think it has to be about motivation, and I was wondering about what your ideas are of how we can accomplish that.
I think some of it is motivation. I think some of it was just over enthusiasm of, well, look, all these classes are available. I'm going to sign up for 10 of them. And you wouldn't really expect to get 100% completion from that. So I'm not sure we're really that far off. I'm not sure that you want the rates to be that much higher than they are.
So I think Peter is absolutely right. A lot of people signed up for the class just because it sounded cool and they wanted to see what it was about. I think the right denominator to use is the number of students who submitted the first assignment, because I think that is the ones who engage with the class at least in some meaningful way. Our completion rate for that is close to 50%. Not all of them passed the class, but if you count the number of who passed the class, say in the machine learning class, that's about 30%. 30% pass rate is actually commensurate with a lot of physical universities, and I don't think it's that bad. You know, these are hard classes, and people say, oh, machine learning sounds cool, let me try it, and they realize that it's, wow, it actually involves math, oh my God. So I think it's quite reasonable to have a 30% pass rate. Now, there are various things that one can do to improve retention. I think social is a big aspect to improving retention. Right now, study groups, for example, are kind of tangential. They're external to our system, but they happen, and I think they help retention. I think if you embed that more intrinsically in the platform, you're going to get increased retention because people are going to be unhappy about disappointing their group mates. So I think there's ways to improve retention, but I don't think, I mean, Peter's right, you cannot expect a much higher retention rate than what we have.
So as Peter sort of intimated at the beginning, these online classes I see as sort of the evolution of the textbook. And like the textbook, I expect that most faculty are never going to create one. But also like the textbook, I expect that many faculty are going to want to consume the ones that are there. And something that worries me a little bit about the way they're evolving now is that they're extremely monolithic. It's not really possible for the faculty member, I mean, in the textbook days, you can say, well, read chapter 1, and then, you know, skip over all of this stuff and then do the following problems. And so building your own course out of the available textbook type material. What is there? Can there be an analog for that with these online course materials? Is it important, or are we just going to give up on all of that and have this one course that everybody in the world takes exactly the same way?
So first of all, I don't think there's going to be just one course. I would expect that we're already starting to see 2 and 3 courses on the same topic offered by different institutions, and I think that's order of one. Okay, order of one. You can see that David's a theoretician, or at least used to be. So I do think that it's possible to then to do mix and match. In fact, one of the original visions that drove me into this is that I am sick and tired of the set of options that are available to me when I rely on some material that I don't want to cover in class. So what are my options? I can add a prerequisite, increasing the prerequisite chain structure, and that's so common in engineering. I can do a half-assed job of teaching that material in 10 minutes, or I can assume that the students get it by osmosis, which is what I typically do. None of this is a particularly good solution. What might be a much better solution is to say, here, David teaches a really good introduction to, computational complexity and NP-completeness, and I'm just going to send them to watch 3 of David's modules on this, and then I could assume that they know that. And so I think that you could definitely mix and match, and that's just, the ecosystem is so new that we just haven't gotten around to that yet.
I think that's right. I think part of what's going on is trying to break things down into smaller pieces. You know, so historically, classes have been a semester long because when you had to sign up for a class in the physical world, there were long lines, and you didn't want to have to do that too long. Now we're seeing the online classes are much shorter. A lot of them are 5 weeks or so. We may go to even shorter units, and then an individual professor can customize them and figure out a path.
Question for the educators here. So when I was at IBM, I remember there was a lot of discussion about things, I think they were called learning objects, and there were standards that people were trying to create with standardized prerequisite labeling and objects, and it was sort of a notion of like object-oriented computing being applied to education that at least theoretically made sense. What happened to those ideas? Because they would seem to be relevant to the discussion that David mentioned. Why did they die?
So there's several sets. There's 2 big sets of standards. SCORM is the older one, and then there's ILS, I think, is the newer one. And currently, most platforms support only a very tiny fragment of ILS, which is joint sign-on, as opposed to any kind of standardization of representation of learning object. As to why it died, I'm a newcomer to this community, so I can't speak to this.
what we do sometimes find is that ideas die, and because they're not practical at a certain point, they come back again later in a different guise. So I don't know whether that will happen here, but it does seem that if we want to mix and match, the notion of a spec as to what that module teaches is actually useful to have. It's going to be needed at some point. Vivian, where are we?
So at Georgia Tech, we've created a Android app that let people learn sign language on their mobile phones. We found that's 40% more effective than doing the equivalent thing on computers or paper. So I'm wondering, for those of you doing stuff online, how many of your lectures are viewed on mobile devices? And is there some correlation with success with the scores?
So all of our, we have full support for mobile in the following sense, that you can view the lectures and do the quizzes on either a smartphone or a tablet. What we don't currently have is the ability to have that work when the device is offline. So you can download the videos, but you can't do the quizzes when the device is offline. We realize that support for offline access is critical, especially in the developing world, and so that's something we're going to prioritize, but hasn't happened yet. We do not have stats on performance in the class as it correlates to the device that the viewer has on.
Yes. I'd like to hear more about either what you're doing or what you're planning on doing regarding crowdsourcing and peer assessment.
I guess that one's mine. So that was the slide that I skipped. What we have put together, I think, what is currently the largest pipeline for crowdsourced grading ever devised. It was used for classes that had enrollments in the 30,000, 40,000 student range. So Scott Clemmer, Scott, where are you? Scott's right there, was our guinea pig. He was the first to try out in his human-computer interaction class, the peer grading pipeline, and actually helped provide a lot of input into how to both the pipeline itself as well as how to construct a good grading rubric. It turns out that it's very easy to construct a bad grading rubric, so you need to be careful with that. So let me talk a little bit about the pipeline, and then maybe Scott wants to jump in. The students submit the work. They get a grading rubric telling them how they ought to grade the work. One of the things that we found that is really critical is that you don't have students grade on a range of 0 to 30 or something like that. You break it down into much smaller pieces, much in the way that you do on Amazon Mechanical Turk. So you have smaller tasks, each on a much narrower scale, like 0 to 3 or 0 to 5, and then you aggregate the results. So the students go through a training phase based on assignments that the instructor grades, but the students don't know the grades, so they're supposed to grade, and the system compares what they did to what the instructor did, so that they're tested as to whether they're reliable graders. And once they pass that training phase, or calibration phase as it's called, they can go out and grade the work of their peers. We have each assignment graded by about 5 people, at least in principle. In practice, it ends up being somewhere between 3 to 5. And the results are aggregated using a robust statistics so that you have some outlier removal and so on. And the student gets both the numerical score as well as qualitative feedback about why they got the grades that they did. Now, one of the really cool things that happened in the peer grading pipeline is that we first tried it in Scott's class, which is a human-computer interaction class where students were grading web designs. What we learned about peer grading, we could immediately transition to Princeton sociology class and Penn's bioethics class, which is one of those unusual cases where pedagogy actually makes its way across both disciplinary and institutional boundaries. So that was kind of a unique thing, and we were quite happy with that. So anyway, one of the things, so in the Princeton sociology class, they did their entire midterm this way, and 2 interesting things happened. First, the students asked that the peer grading process be kept open longer, not because they couldn't finish their peer grading, but because they wanted to peer grade more stuff because they felt it was actually a valuable learning experience for them. And the second thing that happened is after the grades were made public, there was a whole forum thread about how people said they were concerned initially that the grades they would get wouldn't be reflective of the quality of their work, but they found that in fact it was very consistent with their own self-assessment of their work, and so it was actually working for them. So people were pretty happy with the results. Scott, you wanna? Okay.
I just wanted to say I haven't done any experiments with that yet, but one thing I wanted to do was think about using clustering. So you get 100,000 essays back. We have good algorithms for saying how close are two texts, two web pages to each other. So maybe cluster those 100,000 into a couple hundred clusters, and then you can have TAs or somebody grade the median of each cluster and see how well that goes to the other members.
So just as we think about this, and we heard from Bradley about social, this is where all this so connects into the social world, and I think there's just a tremendous opportunity to see how these things integrate in existing social environments. I don't know if you have any thoughts on that, Brad, that you'd like to talk about.
Well, I think a couple that were mentioned that I think are huge opportunities are both formalized study groups and ad hoc study groups and sort of one-to-one tutoring. We've been approached, I mentioned language instruction is happening on Google+. People want to turn this into a business. They sort of want to be able to do language instruction and music instruction at a distance, so that a great instructor in the Philippines can sort of help someone anywhere else in the world and make a living doing it. So there's all kinds of peer-to-peer interactions that are happening. There's a huge culture of generosity on the service. It's amazing the amount of time people will invest helping others for no material return at all. But there's also the opportunity for businesses to actually make a difference in people's lives so that people with skills that they want to offer can also get compensated for that. And I think all of these are opportunities that are really nascent, and platforms that we're building at Google will help people explore the spectrum of what might be done.
Have you thought about academic misconduct, and what are you planning to do about it?
Is that like cheating?
Yeah. Yeah, please.
It's called collaboration now.
We know cheating happens. We've seen, for example, Jennifer Whittam has written a blog post about her experiences in the database class, about how people took the final exam, which was supposed to take 3 hours, and they walked in and they did the whole thing in 10 minutes with perfect scores. And what turned out is that they had 3 accounts. They traced it back using IP addresses. They did the first time, they got like 70%. They did it the second time, they got 80%. And then when they got the third time, they basically nailed it. So we know that happens. We've seen that happening in other ways in other classes as well. It's definitely an issue, but let me add that it also happens in much more proctored environments. I mean, who remembers the SAT scandal at the beginning of the year, where this guy was taking the exam for 20 of his closest friends, of whom 2 were girls? So it shows, I mean, I don't think it's completely avoidable. I think there is technological as well as physical solutions. So for example, Udacity has talked about doing Pearson testing centers as one possible solution. There's technology, so Western Governors, which is one of the biggest online programs out there, it's actually a very nice program, does proctoring using a 360-degree camera. Plus a microphone, so that the student is doing the exam with a human as well as a computer kind of doing some clever monitoring of what's going on. So I think it's a technology that's already come a long way, and there's some interesting ideas out there.
So let me ask this question. How does the industry of education structure itself as time goes on? So we've admitted to the possibility that faculty members from one university may create modules or courses that are used at others. We've admitted to the possibility there may be standardized testing centers, which may be used sort of broadly from many classes and many disciplines because they have the cameras and they check people's driver's licenses and faces and such. There are enormous opportunities for sort of different ways that people can aggregate themselves into groups and hang out together, might be part of different structures. We've also, just as one of the underpinnings of this, John Hennessy spoke at the CRA Snowbird Conference for deans and department chairs on Sunday night of this last week. And basically, he elucidated and highlighted the enormous cost of education today and said we just can't afford it. So there is going to be radical change. I mean, he was quite, I would say, incendiary in his remarks, particularly for a university president, about the fact that there just had to be enormous change in terms of the cost structures at universities and in K through 12, which means less employment for the same amount of teaching. So how do you think all this is going to play out? Everyone is welcome to speculate. I think it's quite interesting. It affects many of us. we'll give you a chance to. And then let's give a chance to comment over here on Mike's question.
I'm in Michigan, University of Michigan. We have a Northern Michigan University, Central Michigan University, Western Michigan University, and Eastern Michigan University. And in 5 years, they're gone. Yes, what they're all about is social, right? That's all those places are all about. It's about social, about getting together, about a history, and all the courses that we're talking about, those kids can sign up for. There's no question about it. And so the question is how the transition is going to happen. Because the transition is going to happen. And I think it's going to happen in 5 years.
I don't know. But here's a representative of a university I think will be around in 5 years.
Well, so I think that I think it is a really interesting transition that we're about to see, and there are it's clear, I think, that universities that want to survive are going to have to rethink drastically what is the value proposition that they're offering their students. And I think universities such as Peter said, I think Stanford is probably safe, but it's not clear that many of the other universities out there are safe unless they really think carefully what it is that they're offering to their students besides content. Because content is going to become ubiquitous, it's going to become free, and it's going to be available, frankly, at higher quality than most universities can produce themselves. And so what are you offering to your students beyond that? And does it really require 4 years of residential education? Or can you make do with something that is a lot shorter and more efficient in the resources that are required? And I think universities that do that have a chance of surviving, but those that bury their heads in the sand probably are going to be in trouble.
What I heard is that there'll always be a future for the universities as a proctoring center for Udacity and Coursera. So there's that.
I think that there is a value proposition to universities. I think that the socialization, the flipped classroom, the kind of face-to-face mentoring, for students who are not getting the material quite so well, I think there's a tremendous value for the kind of interaction with an instructor who can get together a small group of students and we're all struggling with the same material and have a small tutoring session for 10 or 15 of them. I think that is where you're going to see the big value, and that's what I meant about rethinking the value proposition.
I'll get it to you in a second, but let me just add, I think there's another opportunity is that universities have been missing a large part of the potential audience in that they've kept students for 4 years and then let them go. But I think it's clear now that that's not enough, that people are going to need continuing lifelong education, and the universities could perhaps capture some of that back.
Alfred, if, with your permission, I want to make a comment rather than ask a question. But this pertains to David's comment. And it's, I think, kind of good news in the gloomy news of consolidation and disintermediation. The new kind of packaged online courses are the new textbook. And the units are small. And even so, I taught one of those classes with another instructor from economics. And even when we teach the course ourselves, we teach it slightly differently because he's an economist, I'm a computer scientist. And what we're doing now is we're opening it up as a platform, inviting colleagues, including you, to submit their modules and really turning it into a platform. And so just like it's not necessarily the people from the top university who wrote the best textbook, there's an opportunity for individuals to write super modules. So I think that's kind of called the age of the academic remix, maybe, on us.
I have a higher level question. So how do the panel people feel about what kind of a material fits in this massive online teaching well? What kind of material doesn't? Do you, is this specifically for university course teaching where you envision this will go beyond that?
Well, Clearly, I think there's some limitations to this, at least using current technology. I mean, anything that involves an interaction with a physical object is going to be difficult to do in this medium right now. So you're not going to learn to do surgery in this using this technology or to play the violin. But I think we're starting to see that more, or to do lab work, for example, even chemistry lab or biology lab. Simulations are still not quite there yet. Maybe for physics, yes, but for the wetter disciplines, probably not quite. Technology is improving all the time, so I would hesitate to make a prediction that in 5 years this would still be out of reach. And I think that this is something that will be available not just for academic university content, but also for a lot of the skills-based activities or courses that would help close the skills gap that we're seeing in the structural unemployment that we have right now, where at the same time that we have 9-10% unemployment, more so in certain states, there's still large numbers of jobs that are going unfilled. So I think it is possible to use this technology to help deal with some of those fundamental problems that we have in society.
So following up on that, actually, if this structured education, which is possible to do online with structural grading or the structural instruction, becomes cheap, then more people would be able to afford that education, but not the hands-on, which is learning by doing, like the surgery, like the lab courses and so on. Do you see that kind of model now shifting, creating a bias which would shift away education for the skills that are hands-on ones?
I think that the solution will come to meet the needs. So you could easily imagine, for example, the same way that physical study groups form, you will have small physical centers in different towns where people can come and do the hands-on practice that is needed for the kinds of skills that require that. So I think that this is a problem that will be solved. I'm not really worried about that.
So what's the financial argument for an institution to dedicate the resources to retool a class to offer it to tens of thousands of students for free?
Okay, so I think that's a good question, and it has several parts to the answer. First of all, the costs are not enormous. I mean, you could design, and that's what I think both Udacity did and we did and others, is that you don't have to pay several hundreds of thousands or millions of dollars. So some of the online offerings previously were $5 million, $15 million per course. You don't really need to do that if you're not aspiring to Pixar quality production values, which I actually don't think are pedagogically all that useful. And so we're talking on the order of $10,000 to $30,000, basically a cost of 1 or 2 TAs. That often amortizes over time, because if you move your class to an auto-graded format, you need less grading down the line in future offerings of the class to your on-campus students. And so I think the costs, they exist, but they're not enormous. And then, of course, there's the benefits of that in terms of impact, outreach, attracting people to your institution, and various other things.
So I'm going to stop playing the role of being a moderator and actually be a debater just for the moment. Not that you like to debate anything, but I think it's an open question on this, actually, as to how much money we should be spending on some of these courses, and whether there aren't some courses that maybe we shouldn't be spending $10 or $20 million to build. I'm not sure we know how to do it yet. But here's the point. So let's say algebra. So if we want to teach algebra to the students, say just in the United States, there are 300 million people, so there must be like 5 million kids or something like that take algebra, or that at least should take algebra. If you get 5 million kids at $10 a kid, which is a very small percentage of the cost of that course being offered, you could hypothesize you could spend $50 million. Now, you don't have to teach the variability and ability that Peter talked about as problematic. We could break those kids down into different categories that are suitable for different modes of instruction, the possibility of online simulation and games and things like that. It's not inconceivable to me that we wouldn't want to go do a lot of research and simulation, gaming, and all manner of things, machine learning, and really turn the way we teach algebra completely upside down. So the reason I'm being a little bit argumentative is that we can do videos are easy, right? I mean, YouTube makes this trivial. A camera and a video is a video. And we can do multiple choice problem sets extremely easily and record the data. That's the present, that's great. That's going to be something which is going to make Coursera have lots of courses and Udacity and all manner of other things. A lot's going to get out there. But what are we going to do as computer science researchers that really completely turn everything upside down with a lot more power that these machines have that we aren't doing today. I don't know what you guys think of that, but that's trying to be a little hard.
Yeah, I think there's going to be a big range, right? So there's going to be these head courses that are taught to lots of people and are expensive, and then tail courses that only a few people are going to see. So it will be the tool sets and the means of production and so on to handle all of them.
I think that's right. I think there's a small number, I don't know how many, it's more than 10, maybe more than 100, but certainly not much more than 100, I think, where it's worth investing that amount of money. But I think that there's a very large number of courses that change so quickly that really, if you start investing that amount of money in it, then it's just going to become unsustainable, because people are going to be so afraid of making any change to the material because it's going to cost so much, and you have to bring in a whole production team again to shoot that one 10-minute segment that you want to change, that I think it's going to become unsustainable. So I think for the vast majority of courses, you don't want to go to that level of production values because it's going to stultify innovation.
So I believe you heard twice from both Daphne and Peter that what really made this last set of courses take off, as opposed to previous free online content, was that there was a structure. There were assignments, there was a community run on some schedule. And I wonder what we can learn from these experiments in formal education for the type of informal education that Bradley talked about, where it's maybe woodworking or kiteboarding. Would the platforms look the same, or are there important differences if we want to enable people to teach each other, but maybe in a more structured setting than just having video chat or a hangout?
Yeah, I think it's a great question. I think just to reflect a little bit on the questions that have been asked before and how they relate to that question. We have sort of seen this movie before. I think it's a very good question. What is the financial model that will sustain everything we're talking about up here? And I think we collectively absolutely don't know. That's clear. We know there's a disruption underway. We've seen this before with the music industry, where they controlled distribution. They had a certain studio model and label model and marketing model and physical distribution, and it all blew up over a decade and changed everything. And they're still figuring out what it means for the industry. I don't know if people are previously bootlegging your lectures with, surreptitiously recording them in class and posting them to YouTube. I'm not sure it's exactly the same, but I think there is a disruption happening right now, and I think it's generally better to get in front of these and be part of the solution and drive toward that than to cling to old models that are slipping away before your eyes. That's my commentary there. The other previous answer that occurred to me is, what do universities become? Every professor I've known, and this says, well, this isn't true. I know many of you, so I don't want to generalize. Most of the professors I know, a lot of the teaching they do is a tax that they pay, so the research that they love can happen. At least some fraction of teaching might be tedious for folks. You don't want to tell the same jokes, for 250 years. So that part, I think everyone would breathe a collective sigh of relief if your sort of cognitive load doing that part of your job was relieved, so you could do the part that is valuable and fun and invigorating for you. Now, to the question about, informal ad hoc learning, that's mostly what's happening on Google Plus right now. And again, it's sort of staggering to think that it's happening without any orchestration or incentives from us. People are just finding each other and doing this, and frankly, we're not making it particularly easy. We do have tools like whiteboarding and screen sharing. We do not have sophisticated tools for monitoring, measuring, picking up where you left off, and bringing like-minded people together. All of that is happening in an ad hoc way. So I hope that there's a continuum there, and that the tools that they are building for very specific higher education use cases could apply for other sort of less, academic pursuits, but more sort of skills-based learning as well. And I do think, you mentioned a couple examples of surgery and music instruction. Both of those things are happening on Google+. I mentioned an example. It's not surgical instruction, and I wouldn't want to go to a doctor who is trained on Google Plus Hangouts today, and I wouldn't want to hear a symphony that, you know, played together. We actually did a YouTube symphony, actually, but they were generally trained musicians brought together at that point. But I do think it is interesting to think about the spectrum of things you can learn. And if you look at the tools that we're providing, many of them are shadows of real world experience. You know, much of learning is visual and much of learning is reading, and we can provide reasonable facsimiles of that. The tactile aspect of learning and the opportunity to interact with physical objects is something, again, we can't completely provide today. But I think much of learning can be approximated through these means, and it's not just a pale shadow of the classroom interaction. It's actually, as you have pointed out, an opportunity to get a much improved experience. That's what's really exciting, is that it's not degraded. It's actually a higher order of learning that we're able to provide.
We can take 2 quick questions. Okay, so you're in charge.
Okay, thanks. So one thing I just want to say is virtual knee surgery is actually a game about learning surgery skills, an online game. I was just curious, I know you said this sort of fidelity of production values, which I sort of agree with a lot. I'm curious if you guys have any assessment of bandwidth necessary to interact with these courses. You're talking about reaching audiences in the developing world. You know, I'm thinking about even here in the U.S., you know, the penetration of broadband is really poor, and a lot of the areas that could benefit the most from these kinds of things are rural and poorly connected. And is there some sort of push that needs to happen in that in order to support some of the outcomes you're talking about?
I think the answer is clearly yes. One of the things that modern encoding technology has done is it allows, especially the tablet-based reporting, which is a lot of what we're currently seeing, is much more efficient in bandwidth than a professor moving around in front of the blackboard, and so it actually can be done at fairly low bandwidth limitations. But that said, I think in order to really reach the developing world, we will need to come up with better technological solutions, both in terms of improving the infrastructure in those countries, as well as by constructing mobile solutions that can work offline, so that you can come in, download whatever the course needs to do, and then you can go off and work on it. And that is definitely on our to-do list, because we do really want to reach the developing world, and even in the United States.
Last question.
So Peter, really all of you talked about the importance of motivation, and few things are more motivating, especially to teenagers in video games. It'd be interesting to have you say a little bit more about the gamification of learning, and whether we expect to see more of that. That's something that you could do a lot more in an online environment than in the classroom.
Yeah, I think that's right. There's a lot of work in that. I mean, in some ways, traditional education is already gamification, right? Because we have this grade you get at the end of the class, and people play the game to do that more than they do to learn. And so you have to be aware of what are you motivating people to do, and you want the carrot there to help them, but not to get them too distracted. And I think there's lots of interesting research in how that works.
Okay, well, we've kept you a little bit long. Thank you so much, panel. We appreciate it. It's a great discussion. Thank you.